Welcome to the MediaWrites Podcast. My name is Quinn. I'm a trainee solicitor here at Bird & Bird and one of your hosts today, along with fellow trainee Aimee.
Hi everyone. Today we're kicking off our podcast series with family-friendly policies in women's sport. This podcast is also part of our wider women's sports series, which features insightful articles on the MediaWrites website, so do check those out as well. We will be shining a spotlight on sporting bodies' updates to maternity rights, areas where there is still a lack of clarity surrounding miscarriages and stillborn children, and the legal risks and possible claims that may be brought in this area.
Joining us today are two guest speakers, Natalie Ali, an associate in the employment team, and John Goldsworthy, a partner in the employment team.
Let's dive right in.
So, starting with sporting bodies' updates to maternity rights, FIFA recently amended its regulations on the status and transfer of players in respect of female players and coaches on the 1st of June of this year. So Natalie, could you tell us a little bit more about this?
Sure, of course. FIFA have now introduced adoption and family leave rights and have expanded existing provisions on maternity leave and breastfeeding, with a key change being that these rights are now available to coaches as well as players. So to run through just some of the changes under the new regulations, female coaches are now also entitled to receive 2/3 of their salary for the entire duration of their maternity leave, which must be at least 14 weeks. Any reduction in a player or coach's working hours whilst breastfeeding must not result in a salary reduction. Clubs can now sign players outside of a transfer window if they have taken adoption or family leave, not just for maternity leave as was the case under the previous regulations. And players will be entitled to request absence from training or matches because of menstrual health reasons, whilst receiving full pay. Importantly, there is also a requirement for clubs to reintegrate players and coaches on maternity leave back into footballing activity, to agree a postpartum plan and to provide adequate ongoing medical support.
These changes are a welcome step towards creating a more inclusive and supportive environment for women in sport. This is a great start and hopefully something that FIFA and other organisations will continue to develop in the future. Players may choose to take extra leave, albeit on an unpaid basis, and negotiate further with their clubs. It is worth noting that these FIFA regulations are the minimum support clubs must provide, and many clubs will offer enhanced entitlements. There is, of course, likely to be a significant disparity between what elite clubs can offer compared with smaller clubs.
Agreed, and FIFA aren't the only governing body to have taken action recently. The Rugby Football Union introduced new enhanced maternity, pregnant parent and adoption leave policy for players contracted to the England women's team in 2023. This means full pay for the first 26 weeks of maternity leave and additional financial support to cover travel and accommodation costs involved in having their child attend competitions or training camps with them.
While this is obviously a progressive approach by the RFU, its coverage is limited to the truly elite international level English players, and so other women rugby union players, such as those playing at club level in England and those international players at other unions, might not enjoy such benefits, with support being dependent on what the individual club or union is able to offer.
I completely agree. The FIFA amendments will apply to all players licensed by one of its 211 member associations, but we would hope that FIFA will continue to consult with and seek feedback from clubs and associations and other relevant stakeholders on how the new provisions are working in practice and what can be improved in the future.
And Natalie, I know you are a keen tennis player. How does the Women's Tennis Association fare when compared to other sporting governing bodies?
Generally, the WTA is considered quite progressive. So back in 2019, the WTA made significant changes to its rules so that players ranked number 1 to 750 in the world who have returned from pregnancy or starting a family could have immediate opportunities to compete for higher prize money and ranking points. They do this by letting them use a special ranking for a specified number of tournaments, the number varying depending on the length of time off. The special ranking is the ranking the player had immediately prior to commencing her leave, and can be used by the player within 1 year from the date of her return to competition.
The WTA's definition of pregnancy is the medically diagnosed condition of being pregnant, which appears to afford the benefits of its seeding rule to a player not only where they have given birth and then taken maternity leave, but also where players take time off after suffering a miscarriage or having a stillborn child.
But all that isn't to say there isn't work to be done within tennis. For example, Victoria Azarenka and Naomi Osaka, two top players who have had children while playing at the highest level, recently spoke about why introducing maternity pay on the WTA Tour would be life-changing. Another player, Tatiana Maria, has called for creche facilities becoming the norm on tour. She currently travels with her husband and 2 young daughters. John, do you think there is scope for the WTA to provide players with a maternity pay package?
There is definitely scope, and in fact, there have been calls for the WTA to do just that. The Men's ATP Tour has recently introduced guaranteed base earnings for players as part of a 3-year trial, a minimum of $75,000 per year for top 250 ranked singles players, which increases to up to $300,000 for the top ranked players. Eligibility will be determined based on a range of criteria, including a player's ranking, career prize money earnings, and the number of events played. The ATP says that the financial support will empower players to plan their seasons with greater certainty, focus on their game, and invest in their teams. This financial support would clearly be a welcome introduction for the women's tour, particularly given the additional maternity-related challenges that women face.
It's definitely an area to watch, but there has been no update from the WTA since Chief Executive Steve Simon wrote that maternity coverage is a topic scheduled for a review in a letter to the leading players following last year's WTA finals.
Thanks, Natalie. So, John, you mentioned just now that the WTA's definition of pregnancy is broad enough to cover players taking time off after suffering miscarriage or having a stillborn child. Would you consider this to be progressive in women's sport?
Definitely. There is a real lack of clarity around the rights of those who tragically suffer a miscarriage or have stillborn children, despite the emotional and physical effects. The new RSTP does now include a provision entitling female players and coaches to medical leave on full pay if they are unable to provide supporting or alternative services due to medical complications related to a pregnancy, subject to provision of the medical certificate, and an explanatory note now confirms that this is to be interpreted broadly to include early termination, which must presumably include miscarriage. However, since there do not appear to be any time restrictions on medical leave, it is unclear what would actually be deemed acceptable by sporting institutions in practice, and whether this includes emotional effects in addition to just the physical.
It's worth noting that this is an area which employers and organisations more generally have been slower to address, not just in sports. If a child is stillborn after 24 weeks of pregnancy, statutory maternity and paternity rights apply. But there is still no statutory right to maternity, paternity, or parental bereavement leave if a miscarriage happens in the first 24 weeks of pregnancy. The physical impact in particular, as well as the psychological impact, may be matters to consider further in a sporting context.
Another thing for governing bodies to consider would be whether and what support could be provided for players undergoing fertility treatment.
That's a really interesting point. Dame Laura Kenny, the Olympic cyclist, has spoken about women struggling to get pregnant because of their athlete lifestyle. For example, many female athletes expend more energy in training than they eat, a side effect of which can be missed periods, making it almost impossible to fall pregnant. Fertility support can be hugely expensive and emotionally distressing. Following a miscarriage and an ectopic pregnancy, Laura has spoken about how she stopped caring about winning medals when all she really wanted was to have a baby. One idea for fertility support was recently suggested by former US Open champion Sloane Stephens, who has advocated for players' rankings to be protected if they choose to freeze their eggs, since the egg freezing process can have both a physical and mental impact on women, which can of course affect their performance when they return to the court.
Thanks, that's really interesting. And Natalie, talking of medals and Olympic athletes, the Paris 2024 Olympics is aiming to be the first fully gender-equal Olympic Games. Are there any specific measures which have been put in place to support competing mums?
Yeah, there seems to be a real effort in Paris, and for the first time, the Olympic Village will feature a nursery to help athletes more easily spend time with their children alongside their training and competing schedules. The French Olympic Committee has also made special accommodation for a dedicated breastfeeding space at a hotel near the Olympic Village for French athletes.
It is interesting, though, that these measures have been pushed forward by athletes themselves. For example, retired American sprinter Allyson Felix, who is now a member of the International Olympic Committee, worked on a partnership with Pampers to offer Paris 2024 athletes access to nappies and baby products.
Yeah, that's right. And Jamaican sprinter Shelly-Ann Fraser-Price spearheaded efforts for the Olympic nursery. But there does appear to be good progress given that COVID restrictions had originally prevented athletes from being accompanied by their families at the Tokyo Olympics in 2021. Again, it was female athletes who led the charge for permitting athletes who were breastfeeding to bring their children with them. However, there is still clearly more to be done. For example, British rower Matilda Hodgkins-Byrne set up a GoFundMe page to help with the cost of taking her child and partner to Olympic qualification events, as the funding she received would only cover her own costs. Similarly, Dutch table tennis player Britt Erland also set up a GoFundMe account to raise money in pursuit of her Paris 24 dream after her support and sponsorship stopped after the birth of her baby.
This is all very interesting. Now, we can't have a podcast with lawyers without asking about the risk of legal claims. So, are there any particular claims that sporting organisations should be aware of?
The legal risks for sporting organisations are similar as for most employers, but as we've talked about, maternity and pregnancy provisions and the different considerations for competing athletes mean this can be a high-risk area. For example, footballer Sara Björk-Gunnarsdottir, captain of Iceland and current Juventus player, brought a claim against Liang for more than £72,000 in compensation after she'd suffered a pay cut during her maternity leave. Liang has mentioned the situation was due to certain restrictions in French law when it comes to maternity policies and a gap between French provisions and FIFA provisions. In a press release, Liang said that they were delighted FIFA had established a legal framework for players who have had to go through maternity during their career. Liang likewise highlighted their own efforts to make French law evolve further in this area and have stated they would be delighted to involve Gunnarsdottir in their efforts to enable all athletes to enjoy their pregnancy to the full as well as return to competition.
It just goes to show that this is a really sensitive area, and employers and sporting organisations may want to think about their maternity leave and return to work policies to see if they are fit for purpose, putting themselves in the shoes of female athletes to see if any changes could be made to make their organisation a more attractive place for female athletes.
And that's a wrap on our episode. A huge thank you to Natalie and John for their invaluable contributions, and a huge thank you to you, our listeners, for taking the time to join us today.
If you enjoyed our conversation today, don't forget to check out our accompanying articles in the Women in Sports series on our website, MediaWrites.law, where you can find articles covering some of the topics discussed today, as well as a range of other articles in the Women in Sports series and beyond. Do also follow us on social media at Two Birds Media on X and the Bird and Bird Media Entertainment and Sports page on LinkedIn to stay up to date with the latest Mez insights from Bird and Bird. Take care and see you on our next MediaWrites podcast.